In this week's series of clips, we're going to look at virtual reality as a research method. So by now you will be familiar with the basic distinction between how VR can be used and has been used in scientific research as an object. So VR itself is the object of study. As an application, so you really use VR to train people or to treat people and change their behavior, hopefully, later on in the real world. But this week we'll look at VR as a method. And Fox and colleagues define this as the use of VR to study real-world phenomena through a virtual simulation of that real world. And you could actually even say that it should be a bit broader. So VR can be used to answer fundamental research questions, questions that you may have as a researcher, as a student, as a scientist, that are fundamental in nature. And with fundamental, I mean that they are sort of derived, they're coming from your curiosity. You have this question, you want to know the answer. Probably it hasn't been answered yet. You do a literature review and you find that your question hasn't been answered yet. It's a fundamental question. You want to know the answer, so you want to find out. And you can do this in many ways. And one way in which you can do this is use virtual reality to come up with a certain, for instance, experimental paradigm and find an answer to your question. And often this means mimicking the real world in the lab, placing participants in the lab in a virtual equivalent of the real world and see how they behave, measure certain things, see how they respond to things, and find the answer to your question. I thought for this series of clips, let me start in the first clip, which is giving away the take-home message for the 10 clips as a whole. So what you will learn in this series is that ecological validity and experimental control are not two extremes in a continuum, which basically means that if you are using VR as a research method, it's often possible to create a situation that is ecologically valid. In many ways, that means it can resemble the phenomenon, the real world phenomenon that you're interested in. So say you're interested in how people talk to each other, how this works in their brains, in their minds, what kind of mental cognitive processes are going on when people talk to each other. Then you're interested basically in building theories about how people communicate in everyday life. Well, this kind of everyday life aspect of communication, you can very nicely mimic in the lab. So actually the place where you're studying your question then very much resembles the sort of everyday phenomenon that you're interested in. So you can assume then that your experimental paradigm has high ecological validity. At the same time, VR offers you experimental control. So you have a lot of control about what happens in the lab, in your simulation, in your experiment. So you can really focus on the aspects of your theoretical question that you're mostly interested in. So the idea is that VR combines those two constructs and therefore often has to offer something that traditional other research methods don't. Yeah, so what we also find out in this series of clips is that immersive VR offers unique opportunities for language and communication research. So I'll give you quite some examples about this, showing you what can be done in VR if you have questions related to language, related to communication. Yeah, and what this will also show, I think, is that in the language sciences, in the study of everyday communication, human communication, there might be a shift of focus because of this new method. So there might be more focus, theoretical focus on the interaction between the different types of channels and modalities that people use to communicate. And also towards interaction with the non-linguistic environment. So in the past, often language researchers, experimental language researchers have focused on one channel of communication. So for instance, they only looked at people's speech, what kind of words people produced, while ignoring things like the hand gestures that people make or the eye gaze that people naturally have while they're talking, or the facial expressions that people have. I think VR nicely offers to look at all those things at the same time in a very rich, larger non-linguistic environment. And since those opportunities are there now, this might also lead to a shift of focus in terms of theories that will more and more focus on how those different channels interact, rather than just looking at speech or just looking at hand gestures or just looking at facial expressions. All right, so those are the take-home messages. And if you watch all 10 clips, then you'll learn more what this actually, with those 3 points here, actually entail.